wanted to first off start with the whole question of with imperialism, just so that we're clear that imperialism is a world system. It's about the clash between nation states. It's not the domination of big states. So it's not the domination of small states by bigger states is a symptom. It's a consequence of that clash between nation states. But fundamentally is about the economic competition that's intrinsic to capitalism, spilling out beyond the national borders, and the nation states actually playing a role in extending that competition between the nation states. And of course what goes along with that is the military capacity of those nation states to actually, for the economic competition to blend into military competition. So I think that's where the fundamental understanding of why war is actually intrinsic to capitalism comes from that very understanding. So I think there's a few things that actually can follow from that. I think we're not going to deal a lot with the First International and the Second International, but I think it's important to understand in that respect that the socialist parties and the Labour parties that were part of the Second International prior to the First World War were actually were committed to, at least in words as it turned out, but were committed to actually doing everything they could to prevent the outbreak of the First World War. But when it came to the First World War, actually all those constituent pretty much all the constituent Labour parties and socialist parties, collapsed and supported their own ruling class in the course of that war. The thing that's important, I think, is that what the group of people who didn't, that small number of revolutionary socialists who became the core of the Bolsheviks, Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin for the Communist Party in Germany, but there's a very, very small number. Actually, in September 1915. The motion to turn the imperialist war into a class war that was carried, at Zimmerwald was carried to 19 to 12. I mean, that's the small number of people actually got together in Europe, to discuss that. It's carried 19 to 12 to turn the imperialist war into a class war. But that became, I think, the political understanding, that led the Bolsheviks in particular into their attitude to the war and Russia's involvement in the war, and it underpinned what was understood as revolutionary defeatism. That the main enemy, your main enemy for socialists is at home, is your own ruling class, and that you work assiduously for the revolutionary defeat of your own ruling class, which means you don't subordinate class demands. There's the class struggle to the war effort and so forth. I'll come back to that. come back to that a little bit. That understanding about turning the imperialist war into a class war really underpinned the three demands that were part of the Bolsheviks' victory in 1917: peace, bread, and land, and recognising the question of the war, the way in which the war had, anyway, I won't go into that, but that's, I think, crucial to understand that. And their victory in 1917, actually taking Russia out of the war, was then also crucial to what in 1918 with the revolution, in Germany, that finally takes Germany out of the First World War. So I think in that respect, World War I's an imperialist war. World War II is also an imperialist war. I mean, the complications associated with that, but I think it's quite important that we understand that World War II was an imperialist war, and socialist revolutionaries took the same position, that it was an imperialist war, and we had to work for an end to that imperialist war as well. I mean, most of us here are more familiar, I think, with the anti-imperialist and national liberation struggles which came subsequently to the Second World War, of Cuba, Algeria, Zimbabwe, Vietnam, and so forth, where again the main enemy was at home. Many of us were involved in those struggles against the imperialist intervention, against our own ruling classes' involvement in those struggles. But what happens with the end of the Second World War? In particular, I'm going to jump ahead there. We go from a multipolar situation where you've got a number of nation states of Germany, France, Britain, Italy, the United States, that were described imperialism at the First World War. But at the end of the Second World War, what emerges really is two blocks. So what you come out of it with a bipolar imperialist world between the East and the West, the US and USSR. And I think that in terms of understanding how what's happening in Ukraine, I think we have to look at how NATO actually emerges from that imperialist division at the end of the Second World War. So NATO is formed in 1949. It's not a defensive operation. I think it's quite important that we understand that the US constructed NATO as a way of actually extending its influence in the world. It was summed up, I think, by one of the first NATO General Secretary of Russia out, USN, and Germany down. So it was sort of very much conceived as a way in which the US was going to actually conduct and control kind of world affairs as much as it possibly could. I won't go into all the kind of the ins and outs about NATO in that respect. Suffice to say, for this discussion, I think, is that NATO itself wasn't used in the Cold War, and I think that's also quite interesting. But with the end of the Cold War, actually you start to see NATO becoming the mechanism which the US uses to actually intervene. So in 1992, it intervened in the Bosnian wars. It used NATO to do that. 1999, similarly in Kosovo's extension of the collapse of Yugoslavia. 2003 in Afghanistan, and then later again, in Libya. So it's very clear, even in that small thing, that we're not looking at, that it's the conscious use of NATO to extend US military power is a very, very conscious one. The other thing which I think that we need to look at is actually the collapse of Russia. Not in any great collapse of the Soviet Union, not in any great detail, but for those who are familiar with the international socialist tendency, Solidarity is a part of. Our conception is that Russia is a state capitalist country, and I think I'll just come back to that in a tick. But the collapse of the Soviet Union, what you saw was a whole range of the satellite states that have been part of the republics of the Soviet Union actually break away from the Soviet Union, and many of them then became incorporated into NATO itself. It's worth saying that even as early as 1991, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there's already discussions inside NATO about the importance of trying to incorporate Ukraine, even though that was going to be some way in the future. But to get some idea of that expansion of NATO, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in 1999, Poland and Hungary joined. In 2004, it's Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. 2009, Albania and Croatia. 2017, Montenegro, North Macedonia. 2008, there was discussion about Georgia and the Ukraine actually being incorporated into NATO. So it's very clear, even from that sort of history, that what we're looking at was that the US and NATO taking advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union to extend those boundaries. And it has to be said in that context as well that there had been certain undertakings given to Gorbachev at the time, subsequently to Yeltsin, about not pushing the boundaries of NATO to the east. But that's not what happens. Actually, that's not what happens. It's not what happens at all. And that what's it said? I was trying to think. It was Yeltsin in 1991 actually raises the issue about Russia becoming part of NATO, but is effectively repulsed. Actually, Putin himself raises it in 2000, and is also effectively repulsed. So the idea that NATO was this broad church that people could be a part of is just simply not the case. I think it's also worth noting that 2019 India was given special defence status by the United States, which is kind of a prelude to incorporating and extending sort of the military collaboration between the US and India, and it's kind of similar status it's given to other NATO allies prior to, like Israel and South Korea, for example. The one thing that I wanted to, I said before, many of us were familiar with the situation of anti-colonial struggles, I think, and of where opposing the United States and Australia's involvement, in Vietnam, of agitating in the context of that for, strikes, against the military machine. We celebrate the action that the Siemens take over the Japarut and the Boonaroo, where they refused to staff those ships that were, taking armaments, to Vietnam. We built the demonstrations. We organised the anti-conscription, against national service, sort of struggles in the context of actually fighting against American Australian imperialism, in Vietnam. And there was one other example I wanted to raise, was the issue of Korea, which was between 1950 and 1953, because in that struggle, even though it starts with an invasion from the north of the south, what that war turns into is an imperialist struggle, and it's actually where the kind of the neither Washington nor Moscow slogan actually comes from. So even though the south invades the north, the war itself, and in that case the US actually uses the UN and the UN intervention, but there's massive military intervention by the United States, by Australia, by Britain and others on the side of the south, if you like, and effectively the war becomes a war between Russia and the United States. And I just want to read this from 1950 from Tony Cliff. In their rush for profit, for wealth, the two gigantic imperialist powers are threatening the existence of world civilization, are threatening humanity with the terrible suffering of atomic war. The interests of the working class of humanity demand that neither of the imperialist world powers be supported and that both be struggled against. The battle cry of the real, genuine socialists today must be neither Washington or Moscow, but international socialism. But I think it's one of the examples which stand out, and there are others nonetheless, where in a situation where we see a clash between the United States and Russia, our position, understanding that you're looking at two capitalist imperialist powers, there's nothing socialist about the United States, then we do take that that defeatist position, which I think is important to understand for what's happening at the moment. So I think the other thing, when you look at Ukraine itself, now it might be true that Ukraine is not part of NATO, is not in NATO, but it's also very true that NATO is in Ukraine. And I think when you look, in particular since 2014, again, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the actual struggles which led to the US playing more and more of a role inside Ukraine. But what's very, very clear is there's been a massive build-up of NATO and of military power inside Ukraine, and of intervention by NATO and the West inside the Ukraine. In fact, from 2014, like it's estimated at the time, 2014, that the Ukrainian army could probably be seen to be about 6,000 combatants, was made up of active combatants, so capable combatants, if you like. It wasn't the absolute number, but it's gone from 6,000 in 2014 to actually over 200,000, by 2021. And actually, if you look at simply the raw size of the Ukrainian military versus the size of what Russia has put on its borders, actually they're similar kinds of sizes. Ukraine now has the second biggest after Russia, but the second biggest military in Europe. It's massively funded. Again, it's between 2014 and 2021. The US has put 2.7 billion into it. I've got the figures for the UK, but similar kind of numbers. And from the UK, the UK itself is $1.7 billion loan to Ukraine simply to develop its navy. I could go over as well, like the extent to which NATO has been involved, and even just some of the perhaps I should I think part and parcel of that has been the political shift that's taken inside Ukraine itself. In 2017, Ukraine actually carried legislation that made incorporation into NATO, or joining NATO, a strategic policy of the country, which is a kind of another indication of the extent to which Ukraine and NATO actually welded together. So even in the last couple of years, I mean, again, if you go over many other examples. So April 2021, you had an exercise in Ukraine of 12 other countries, 12 NATO countries in military exercises in April 2021. June 2021, there was another exercise of 30 countries. July 2021, US, Poland and Lithuania were involved in joint military exercises. September 2021, 4,000 Ukrainian troops with 2,000 Lithuanian troops. The UK has actually explicitly trained over 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers. So the scale of what's actually taking place, and the scale of the build-up, that the military build-up is also, tried to give some kind of indication of that even prior to what we've seen. That figure that I used before, the 2.7 billion, that was before the outbreak of this war. But you can just go, and these things are a little bit dated now, but these comes from the first 800 million from 2 weeks ago from the US, and that's been extended. But the 800 million include 800 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, 2,000 Javelin missiles, 1,000 light armour weapons, 6,000 anti-tank, anti-armour weapons, 100 tactical unmanned aerial systems. I could go on. 300 drones, 11 helicopters that were previously meant to be, that were on their way to Afghanistan, have now been redirected into Ukraine. And that's got Germany sent over 1,000 anti-TAC weapons, 500 Stinger. Latvia's sent an anti-missile. So, and on top of all that, you've got the role that America and NATO is playing in terms of intelligence gathering and orchestrating the response by the military. So by the Ukrainian struggle. So in that respect, I think we can actually look at what's happening in Ukraine, not for all the horror that's been created by the Russian intervention and the Russian bombing and the atrocity that's been carried out at Mariupol, for example, but to understand that what we're looking at is really, in the bigger picture, is a clash between the United States and NATO, and Russia, and that Ukraine is actually squeezed in the course of that struggle. So I think in that regard, I think seeing that wider picture, the message for socialists that came out of the experience of World War I, that the real enemy is home, is something that we have to take to heart in the present situation. So I think there are a couple of things I think that flow out of that. The no-fly zones, I think this has probably been discussed, but the no-fly zones and the way in which Zelensky not just has ruthlessly prosecuted the idea of actually establishing no-fly zones, but it's very clear that the no-fly zone would mean that Ukrainian airspace actually being occupied or dominated, controlled by NATO and by the United States, which would bring the possibility of an immediate clash between NATO and Russia much closer together. So we're opposed to the no-fly zone. Similarly with the sanctions, I think if we understand that war is politics by other means, sanctions are war by other means. So the call for sanctions to be imposed. I mean, I could go through a lot of socios. I'm sure some of those things will come up in discussion, but the people who suffer from the sanctions are not the people at the top. We only need to look at Iran, where you've got a period of, a long period, but even in the last sort of 5 years of increased sanctions, it's not the mullahs, it's not the autocrats of Iran that suffer. It's actually the people of Iran, where the argument was ever that somehow or other the sanctions were going to bring about the overthrow of the autocrats in Iran. That simply is not what's happened. It's quite clear that the United States and the West has used the sanctions as part of extending their influence. So I think in that regard, our opposition to sanctions flows from a similar kind of position. The real enemy is at home, and we need to organise an anti-war movement to resist that. I think the other thing which has come out, which hopefully I've already partially dealt with, but if you, there's I think a section of the left, not just now but also historically, which has sided with Russia simply on the basis that the main enemy is the United States and the West. I think that's a very, very mistaken, notion. As I said, if you look at the experience of the Korean War, was quite important for us, establishing the outlook of the international socialist tendency on a global scale of a rejection of the idea that there's simply, east and west of the kind of the campism that said you had to pick the United States or you had to pick Russia. In fact, there is a third camp, if you like, which is, international revolution. And I think again that experience is, important to bring to bear on the situation of Ukraine. So finally, I wanted to, I suppose, enter a little bit with where do we fit in this. I mean, the fact is that Australia is already involved in Ukraine. It was already involved in Ukraine before the extension of lethal aid, which is now making, the Morrison government is making quite a thing about, of sending lethal aid. The Bushmasters that they send on the behest of Zelensky is similar to the similar armoured vehicles. I think it's 120 that Britain are actually sent, and they've got Ukrainians already in Britain actually being trained in the use of those armoured vehicles. So we're still seeing the way in which the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian military is actually integrated to a large extent with the military demands of the West. So Australia's already implicated. But it was already implicated even before that lethal aid, as I said. The question of the US bases here, the role in which Pine Gap has played. We know that Pine Gap has routinely played a part in US and NATO missions historically. It's intervened in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia. We know that the signals control out of Pine Gap were instrumental for that. There's no reason to believe that that the orchestration of drones, of satellite imagery, of other military intelligence is not similarly running through Australia. I think the other element is when we look at Australia in Asia itself. I mean, the fact is that what's happening in Ukraine in many respects is a rehearsal for what's actually happening in the the Indo-Pacific, the encirclement or the extension of NATO eastwards, and the quite aggressive push to extend NATO eastwards is exactly what we see happening in the Indo-Pacific. We've got another session later on to discuss that in in more detail. But when you think about where we situate ourselves, not only are we vital to those US bases, not only do we host those US bases, but we're part of the bases in Japan, of South Korea, of Guam, the 5 bases in the Philippines, the base that the US has in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. We can see the same dynamic actually playing out, imperialist dynamic playing out in the Indo-Pacific as we're seeing in the Ukraine. Finally, I just wanted to deal with the question of building an anti-war movement. We haven't got the anti-war movement we need here. That much is very obvious. We've seen some little glimpses of that kind of possibility, but we're starting to see on an international scale, the kinds of things that may be possible. The fact that airport workers refused to handle military support that was going from Italy to Ukraine in March. Shortly after that, dock workers in Pisa similarly refused to load ships with military equipment that was going to Ukraine. Greek railway workers now have taken action in similar way, refusing to handle military support from Greece to the Ukraine. There's 6th of April. There's a general strike in Greece, which was peppered with anti-war slogans, and they're hopeful of doing something similar. The 7th of May, the Stop the War campaign committee in Britain has actually called for an international day of action. I don't think we're going to see an international day of action of quite the scale that we saw around the Iraq War, but nonetheless we can start to see the momentum actually building up, and I think we stand absolutely shoulder to shoulder with the Greek workers and the Italian workers that have already taken that action and look to that experience, to that example, to try and extend the politics into the unions, into the anti-war movement, in Australia. So in that respect, I think while we have to be absolutely clear, that we're for Russia out. Putin shouldn't be in the Ukraine. But what we're seeing, I think, is a proxy war between the US and and Russia, and in those circumstances, it's not simply a question of calling for Russia out. We need to call for all imperialism out of Ukraine, for NATO's hands off Ukraine, and absolutely no extension of NATO or support from the West for the war that's actually happening in Ukraine. And we've got a particular role to play in Australia. As I said, we can draw on some of the experience from the anti-war movement, from the anti-Vietnam movement, from the anti-Iraq the Iraq war movement in a different kind of way, but the kinds of things that we needed to do there, to build the demonstrations, most of all it was a question of arguing the politics. In Iraq it was mostly over the role of the UN or the question of Islam politics and Islam, to understand how to take a position against a consistent position against the US intervention in Iraq. And I think those examples are actually going to become important to actually build to continue to build the anti-war movement here. As I said, there's a lot at stake. I think we are seeing like a particular clash of those two imperialisms in the Ukraine at the moment. It's already having a big impact across the whole of Europe. There'll be other sessions where we can talk about already. We're seeing the food shortages, the inflation, the extent to which the fossil fuel companies are trying to take advantage to extend their control over their hold over the world economy. I think being clear about the nature of the war and the need to to build an anti-war movement against their own ruling class is actually going to be crucial in the period ahead.